In 1943, with the Pacific aflame and the world at war, Qantas attempted something close to impossible: a clandestine flying boat service from Perth to Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, threading 5,700 kilometers across the open Indian Ocean to bypass Japanese-occupied territory. Crews called it the Double Sunrise because the journey was so long the sun rose twice. One navigational error meant vanishing into the ocean without a trace. Australia faced the same issue then as it does now. The continent sits too far from everywhere. Sydney to London means a stop. Sydney to New York means a stop. The geography simply won. But all of that changes with Project Sunrise. When Qantas launched Project Sunrise, its plan to connect Sydney and Melbourne directly to London and New York with flights of 20 to 21 hours over 9,000 nautical miles, the aviation world saw a classic Airbus versus Boeing brawl. On one side stood a modified Airbus A350-1000. On the other, Boeing's brand new flagship, the 777X. On paper, Boeing held the stronger hand. The 777-8 variant was an ultra-long-haul beast by birthright, with the raw structural payload capacity to fly those distances without dramatic surgery. It wouldn't need to sacrifice as many seats as Airbus to make the range. Yet, Qantas walked away from Boeing and chose Airbus, ordering just 12 aircraft. So, why did the airline reject the structurally superior jet and pick the one that needed a last-minute engineering rescue just to clear the runway? The standard answer says Boeing lost because the 777X is hopelessly late. The real answer is colder and more calculated. The 777X isn't just delayed, it's the wrong economic philosophy for what Qantas was trying to build. Sydney sits roughly 17,000 kilometers from London and around 16,000 from New York. For decades, reaching either from Australia's east coast meant stopping at least once, often twice, through Singapore, Dubai, Doha, Hong Kong, or Los Angeles. The physics were unforgiving. An aircraft carrying enough fuel to fly non-stop couldn't carry enough paying passengers to profit. An aircraft carrying enough passengers couldn't carry enough fuel. Aircraft that could go the distance couldn't pay for themselves. Aircraft that could pay for themselves couldn't go the distance. So airlines turned the constraint into a business model. Emirates funneled Australian traffic through Dubai, Qatar Airways through Doha, Singapore Airlines through Changi. These superconnectors built empires on routes between Europe and Australia, capturing premium passengers who had no choice but to stop somewhere convenient. For Qantas, that meant surrendering high-yielding passengers to carriers who owned the geography. The most lucrative segment, time-sensitive corporate travelers, was paying competitors to endure a 3-hour layover Qantas couldn't eliminate. In March 2018, Qantas tested a partial solution. It launched non-stop service from Perth to London using the Boeing 787-9, covering around 14,500 kilometers in about 17 hours. The route proved that passengers would pay a meaningful premium to skip the stopover entirely. Demand was strong and yields were high, but Perth is not where most Australians live. Sydney and Melbourne, the population and premium travel centres, sit on the east coast, around 2,500 kilometres further. No aircraft in service could reach them non-stop with a commercially viable load. Qantas needed something purpose-built, and it didn't exist yet. Boeing believed it had the answer. The 777X family arrived in two forms: the high-capacity 777-9, built to carry over 400 passengers, and the long-range 777-8, derived by shortening the 777-9. Vast composite wings, fuel-sipping General Electric GE9X engines, the largest commercial jet engines ever built, and folding wingtips that let the enormous aircraft squeeze into standard airport gates. The 777-8 could reach Project Sunrise distances. Boeing's pitch leaned on heritage. Qantas had flown the 707. the 747 and the 787. The relationship ran deep, and Boeing salesmen believed it would carry the day. The trouble for Airbus was that a standard A350-1000 simply could not fly Sydney to London with a viable payload. At 9,000 nautical miles of theoretical range, its tanks would run dry, leaving insufficient fuel for potential diversions. So Airbus engineered an ultra-long-range variant to save the bid. It added a new rear center fuel tank, holding around 20,000 liters, raised the maximum takeoff weight, and kept the same Rolls-Royce Trent XWB-97 engines. Even then, the math demanded sacrifice. To keep weight down, Qantas committed to a low-density cabin of just 238 seats, against 375 to 400 on a standard A350-1000. Over 40% of that cabin would go to first, business and premium economy, including 6 enclosed first suites with full-length wardrobes and flat beds. Airbus had taken an existing, proven airframe and made it into something that would clear the range hurdle. Boeing had shrunk a bigger jet to do the same job. That difference, stretching up versus shrinking down, would decide everything. Stand both aircraft at the end of the runway and the gap is physical. The 777X is fundamentally a heavier, larger structure of aluminium and carbon fiber than the A350. Airbus put a number on it. The standard A350-1000 already weighs roughly 45 tons less than Boeing's offering in terms of their maximum takeoff weight. That weight gap compounds across every line of the operating budget. A heavier aircraft burns more fuel simply to haul its own mass, and Airbus argued the A350 would be more fuel efficient per flight. Landing fees, navigation charges, and ground handling costs at some airports are tied directly to maximum takeoff weight. Before committing, Qantas did something no airline had attempted. In late 2019, it ran scientific research flights using a 787-9, flying non-stop from New York to Sydney and London to Sydney, each exceeding 19 hours, partnering with the University of Sydney's Charles Perkins Centre. Volunteer passengers were fitted with EEG wearables, tracking brainwaves, movement, and sleep. Sleep scientists and fatigue specialists monitored them throughout. The findings overturned conventional thinking. Researchers found the standard practice of serving a heavy dinner and dimming the lights right after takeoff actively worked against the body clock when it clashed with the destination time zone. Arrival time mattered more than total duration. Light exposure, calibrated to the destination, measurably reduced circadian disruption. Meal timing aligned to the destination accelerated adjustment. These were measurable outcomes, and they reshaped the cabin. The A350 uses bespoke lighting that mimics specific sunrise and sunset spectrums, rather than simply dimming. Menus deploy fast-acting carbohydrates with chili, chocolate, and caffeine to keep passengers awake, and tryptophan-rich dairy, chicken, and herbal teas to induce sleep on schedule. Volunteers on these tailored programs reported less severe jet lag and better cognitive performance in the 48 hours after landing. The most visible result is the well-being zone, set between premium economy and economy, with sculptured stretch handles, hydration stations, and guided movement screens to combat deep vein thrombosis on a 20-plus hour flight. Passengers will tolerate ultra-long haul, but only if the experience is engineered around the human body rather than aircraft utilization. Alan Joyce, then Qantas CEO, insisted that buying a plane on paper wasn't itself a deal-breaker. Qantas had committed to the 747 and the A380 before either entered service. The principle wasn't the problem. The track record was. The A350-1000 has been flying reliably in commercial service since 2018. The 777-8 had not flown at all. Worse, it sat behind the 777-9 in the development queue. By late 2019, Boeing was reeling. The 737 MAX was grounded worldwide after 2 fatal crashes. The 777X program was bleeding schedule. The 777-9 flight test campaign that was meant to begin in summer 2019 had slipped. The GE9X needed stator vanes redesigned, and a static test airframe suffered an explosive decompression during structural testing on the factory floor. Because the 777-8 was slated to follow the 777-9, every delay rolled downhill. Qantas needed ironclad guarantees for the what-ifs because the 777X had not flown and its entry into service kept slipping. Qantas's decision wasn't really about which jet was faster or further. It was about what 12 aircraft do to the economics of an entire network and to an entire industry's assumptions. A Project Sunrise return rotation eats roughly 48 hours per aircraft. Depart Sydney in the evening, land London the next morning, rest the crew, service the jet, depart London that evening, arrive Sydney the following morning. Effectively 2 calendar days for one round trip. Each daily Sydney-London service needs about 3 aircraft. Add Sydney-New York and perhaps Melbourne, and 12 aircraft can support only 3 or 4 daily city pairs, with thin resilience for maintenance or disruption. A 787 flying Sydney to Singapore turns around in a single day and moves far more people to far more places. Qantas chose scarcity deliberately. Airlines normally chase utilization because more flights mean more revenue. Sunrise inverts that. It wasn't an operational play, it's a strategic one. Project Sunrise doesn't try to replace hub-and-spoke flying. Emirates will still move millions through Dubai. Singapore will still dominate Changi connections. These carriers serve passengers who want the lowest fare, not just in economy, but in business and first too, and who don't mind stopping. That's the vast middle of the market, and Qantas isn't fighting for it. What Sunrise creates is a new ultra-premium layer above everything else. For the traveler willing to pay more to erase the stopover, Qantas offers something no competitor can match from the Australian East Coast. A single departure, a single arrival, no connection, no intermediate airport. The scarcity is the point. Limited seats on limited flights create value through exclusivity. The passenger isn't only buying transport, they're buying time, and the right to skip the entire hub system everyone else must navigate. That premium tier sits atop a deliberate brand architecture. Having committed to the A350's maintenance and training base, Qantas launched Project Fish in August 2023, ordering 12 more standard A350-1000s to replace its A330s, and secured rights to replace its A380s with A350s from 2032. The 12 Sunrise jets won't generate most of the revenue. They establish the brand position, the airline that flies Australia to the world non-stop. That elevates everything else. There was also a quieter decisive advantage. Qantas already flew the Airbus A330. Because the A330 and A350 share fly-by-wire cockpit architecture, Airbus's cross-crew qualification lets an A330 pilot transition to the A350 in several days of difference training rather than a full type rating. Airbus markets mixed fleet flying as saving up to $1 million per added aircraft per year through lower training costs, less simulator time, and greater rostering flexibility. The 777X would have forced Qantas to build an isolated pool of pilots, mechanics, and spares for a 12-aircraft subfleet sitting awkwardly alongside its 787s. To make the 238-seat economics work, Qantas extracted sweeping productivity concessions from its pilots through a bitter dispute, with management threatening to fly Sunrise under a new, lower-cost employment entity before pilots approved a deal in early 2020. Bolting on a brand new ecosystem on top of that fight made no sense. The custom A350-1000 ULR doesn't exist in standard production. Matching it means years of negotiation with Airbus and waiting for delivery slots. Crew fatigue rules are another barrier. Ultra-long haul demands new duty regulations and rostering, with a 4-pilot, 14-cabin crew complement and a bespoke flight deck rest compartment of 2 bunks and 2 seats. Airlines without the experience face a steep climb. Geography is the hardest barrier. The non-stop value proposition works from isolated geographies. Emirates can't fly Dubai to Sydney non-stop and call it an improvement, because the whole point of Dubai is its position between continents. Australia, at the end of the line, is where bypassing a hub creates real value. Still, every superconnector must now reckon with what Qantas is demonstrating. Stopover hubs are vulnerable to bypass when technology permits, and the assumption that distance requires connection is no longer absolute. 12 aircraft don't scale volume, they scale influence. In December 2019, Qantas named Airbus its preferred supplier, citing the best mix of commercial terms, efficiency, operating cost, and customer experience, and singling out the proven reliability of the Trent XWB. Then, the pandemic froze the project, and during that freeze, Boeing's 777X delays cascaded further. By the time Qantas finished its order for 12 A350-1000 ULRs, the 777-8's passenger entry into service had slipped years away. Choosing Boeing would have delayed Project Sunrise indefinitely. But the delays were the final blow, not the cause. Boeing brought a sledgehammer to a job that needed a scalpel. The 777-8 offered immense payload over immense distance, but it demanded a permanent weight and fuel penalty on every flight, and left expensive empty space inside its oversized fuselage whenever the premium heavy cabin flew. Airbus won by tinkering with a lighter, proven design to clear the 9,500 nautical mile hurdle without poisoning its economics on the other 90% of the network. The first A350-1000 ULR for Qantas made its maiden flight from Toulouse in June 2026, with first delivery expected in April 2027, and the inaugural Sydney to London service, slated for late 2027. In 1943, Qantas flew the original double Sunrise because there was no alternative. Crews endured marathon flights on stripped-down aircraft because the war demanded it. That route was desperation, not innovation. More than 80 years later, Project Sunrise is the opposite. Not a compromise forced by circumstance, but a deliberate choice to build something that didn't exist, to prove Australian geography is no longer a limitation. When those first passengers board, they'll complete a journey that took over 8 decades to make possible. On 12 planes, a handful of routes, limited frequencies, proof that the most significant changes in aviation don't require hundreds of aircraft, they require conviction, custom engineering, and the discipline to reject the heavier jet, no matter how impressive it looked on paper. Hey, before you go, the YouTube algorithm thinks you're going to like this video next, so why not check it out?